Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon at this incredible venue here at Cock Abbey. Can you believe this room that we're sitting in right now? It's absolutely stunning. And I am so thrilled and delighted to welcome you to our final session and introduce our very special guest, Professor Suzannah Lipscomb. Suzannah is an award-winning historian, author, and broadcaster. She is Professor Emerita at the University of Roehampton, senior member at St. Cross College in Oxford, and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and the Society of Antiquaries. On top of all this, she has written and edited an astonishing 7 books, presented history series on BBC, ITV, More 4, and Channel 5, and hosts the successful Not Just the Tudors podcast, of which I'm a big fan, and Findmypast's very own Step Into the Past podcast. An incredible CV, Suzannah.
Thank you.
So welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
It's a real delight to be here, and it's a real delight to meet you, Jen, because Jen is the person behind the Step Into the Past podcast. She's the person who does all the research, so I've only ever known her name, but now I see her face.
Your background in research is extensive. Your areas of interest are fairly well established, but how did you really get into that? What was your drive, your motivation for the Tudor period and everything that you've studied?
So my doctorate's actually on 16th century French history, and that's because I thought, can't possibly do England, it's totally overstudied. Nothing new to say there. And so I was investigating the lives of ordinary women during the wars of religion in France. But then, as I was coming to the end of that, or at least thought I was, I got a job as a curator at Hampton Court Palace. And so we were working to do a new exhibition, a new visitor experience to mark the 500th anniversary of Henry VIII's accession. And so I travelled back in time by about 50 years and across the channel, and then have really sort of been there ever since, stuck in the reign of Henry VIII.
Not a bad reign to be stuck into.
No, I mean, it's a pretty exciting period of history. Yeah.
So your podcast, your numerous TV shows, what drove you to go from academic to media? Was that something you were always interested in pursuing?
No, it came about completely by chance. So whilst I was a curator at Hampton Court, I was asked to do like news, like the One Show and Time Team, to mark the new exhibition. And so I went and did those, and then people asked me to do the talking head thing, the expert contributor stuff, so I did that. And that was all quite fun. And then about 3 years later, someone came along and said, would you like to present a series? And I thought, I mean, why not? It sounds fun, right? And that was 12 years ago, and I sort of just carried on doing it. So what I love about it, though, is I love writing and I love telling stories of history that way, but putting it on TV or in a podcast, it just gives you an opportunity to really work on narrative and really work on storytelling, and also to work with a team. So, because most of what I do is sitting in a room on my own or in an archive, or something lovely like that. But working with a team to make film and podcasts it's really great to do creative things collaboratively. So.
Fabulous, yeah. So before we open up to all of your questions, one more from me just on this kind of genre of your career and what you've spanned. Can you hint at what you're working on at the moment?
Yeah, I can. Well, so several different things. Always podcasts. Podcasts are ongoing. And I've got a new series coming soon on More 4 on the 14th of October, I think, which is called The Royals, A History of Scandals. We did a series about 18 months ago, and we're returning. So we've been filming that this summer. And I'm working on a book about a couple of Henry VIII's queens.
That's exciting. We're going to take questions throughout our session with Suzannah today. So if you have something you'd like to ask, please raise your hand, and we'll have Helen in the back come forward with the microphone. We're going to ask you to speak into, but we will continue to just have our discussion and allow you to put your hand up whenever you're ready. Okay, so at this point, we'll take questions from the audience if anybody has something you want to kick us off with. Or I can just keep talking to her, you guys, it's
just
fine.
Warm up a bit more. Warm up a bit more.
We've got one. Okay, great.
So did I read a flyer that you're connected in some way to Cock Abbey? And if so, how are you connected?
Well, I'm not personally, but we have done, just a few weeks ago, we recorded the first of the new series of Step Into the Past podcasts with somebody who is very much connected to Cork Abbey. And so it was just amazing to come here with her and to go walk up and see the tomb of her ancestor here at the church, and that she didn't know about. I mean, it was so amazing. And to kind of get a sense of connecting a living descendant to the extraordinary history that's here at Cork Abbey. I don't know if I should be reserving any of that, but that's the connection.
And for anybody interested in listening, that podcast episode is live now, and there are QR codes kind of all over the place where you can scan your phone and get access to that episode straight away, so you can listen to it. It's brilliant. I have listened to it. It's fantastic. And
it's really appropriate that we're here in the riding school, because Sandy, the contributor, our guest, one of her ancestors was a groom here at Cork Abbey for 40 plus years. And what's amazing about it is the way that the family who owned Cork Abbey honoured him in life, looked after him in his old age and in death. And the way they did that also speaks to his character. His name is Francis Peace. And so there's this incredible sense of connection with what we're doing now. But also when I took Sandy around, Sandy has worked for most of her career backstage in the theatre. And she was really struck by the parallel that her ancestors had been the people working backstage to facilitate those lives in the spotlight. And I feel moved just telling you about it again. I mean, it was so extraordinary to see those parallels of lives lived.
The stories in that episode that really shone through, I think for me in particular, were pieces and bits of the research that came across about the nonconformists and the other religions. You want to talk a little bit about how you felt on some of that research as well?
Yes, that's really interesting. So Sandy's family were Baptists, and this is at a time, we're talking the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. There was actually a really high proportion of people who were nonconformists, not part of the Church of England. And I think, some of the things that came out about that is this sense that nonconformity allowed a kind of freedom of approach to social mobility, if I can put it like that, because the Church of England at the time had quite a established sense of establishment, of you're in your place, that's your lot, you're born to that, you don't try and get above that, you don't, you stick where you're born. And nonconformity was just a lot more free, and it was also much more interested in trying to alleviate the circumstances of people who were poor. And that's a real tension between the churches at that time. So it was really interesting to look at Sandy's family history and that connection. And I think that will probably be true quite of a lot of us, actually, that there will be I know in some of my family history there is the connection with nonconformity. And I mean, you sort of have to think those people who are interested in improving the lot of others, really.
The nonconformist question is always interesting to me. It's something I've been passionate about researching myself for a long time. And I think many of the people in the room will need to realize that the Church of England really was not the dominant religion that most of us kind of think it is. Right? The 1851 census had an accompanying census of religion, and it showed that about half the population, full 50% of England and Wales, were not Church of England.
It's so fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah. And there were connections to Methodism and other faiths. It's important to understand that diversity of faith, right? So have you had other research experiences, maybe on the other episodes of Step Into the Past, where you've found kind of that similar tendency towards that nonconformist?
Yeah, I mean, it comes up a lot because also one of the sources that I'm telling Jen, one of the sources that you come to when you're thinking about family history is you're drawing on ecclesiastical records, and obviously they can well be Church of England, and we've got births and deaths and marriages quite often there, but we also find them in other churches, and so it's something that we return to again and again, really, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. So for those other episodes, we've done episodes at Back-to-Backs in Birmingham and Avebury. What are the highlights of Step Into the Past for you so far?
So those are obviously two very different locations. We've got Avebury, that's famous for its stone circle, but also has this rural Wiltshire village a closed community, and we were thinking about sort of skilled farm workers in that situation. And then back-to-backs in Birmingham, our guest there, Jan, was connected to 40 different locations around Birmingham in back-to-back areas. And again, non-conformity came up there. But so that, again, that was looking at the lives of people living through the brutal, the hungry 40s, the 1840s, and that period of industrialization and thereafter. And I think, well, there's several different things I love about this podcast. The first is, I'm really interested in the royals. I'm not going to lie. I'm interested in their lives. But I'm also really interested in getting at the lives of ordinary people. And this does exactly that. It's getting at ordinary people's lives. It's doing so in a place where that history happened. And I think there's something so amazingly tangible about being in a space where these people were. You can feel it. And we're tracing it down to a living descendant. So the emotion, the sense of connection to the past is enormous. I find it really moving. I cry quite easily, but I'm brought to tears practically every time we do one of these podcasts because it's just so moving to witness somebody learning this stuff about their past. It's amazing.
I'm hovering for questions, so keep your hands up if you come up with something. Great, in the corner. While Helen moves that direction, you don't have to run, Helen, it's okay.
I just wanted, it's going way back for you. Well, not way back, because you're not as old as me, sorry. That came out wrong.
It's okay, way back is fine.
I just wondered how you got interested in history.
Yeah, so I just had really good teachers. When I was 11, I remember so I went to Nonsuch High School for girls, on the site of Nonsuch, or more or less, she says, knowing exactly how far away from Nonsuch Palace it was, on the site of the palace that Henry VIII built in 1538. And I would walk down streets called Anne Boleyn's Walk to get there. So I feel like there was something in the stars. It was fated. But I remember sticking pictures of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I on my school book. That was at 11. Anyway, I obviously liked it enough to do it for A-level, and I was at Epsom College, and I had this amazing teacher who really introduced me to the archives, the idea that history could change. So at the time we were doing Russian history, and I remember reading a biography of Lenin by someone called Volkogonov, and he had just got into the Russian archives, which had been closed for 50 years. And suddenly he had all this new information, had this completely different view of Lenin. And it suddenly made me realize that history could change, that you can find new information and it completely changes your perspective on the past. And that brought it to life for me. So that's why I did it at university. And, again, I had incredibly people teaching me there. I hadn't decided to be a historian, though. That happened quite by accident. I wanted to work in international development. I was completely convinced that that's where I would go. I spent my entire university career mostly trying to study Asian history, learning Hindi and focusing on that would be my destination. But then I realized that what I wanted to do, this is a bit too detailed, what I realized I wanted to do was something that was better done by people indigenous to the country. And then I was like, well, I don't know what to do with my life. I quite like history. I seem to be quite good at it. So I went and did the master's degree in there.
That moment of discovering the archives are really special places, right? And many of us in this room can attest to that. I think it's true for a historian, a published author, but also for the hobby genealogist sitting at home and making that 2 a.m. discovery when you can't stop looking, right? That moment of discovery is so emotional and so wonderful for all of us. So how do you transition from someone just going into the archives to specifically women's history?
Yes, it's often harder to find the women, especially if you're doing family history, because, they give birth to sons and then die, as far as the family tree is concerned. And it's hard. It's so interesting, because I might do a book on this in the future. I've spent some time looking into one branch of my family in the 19th century, nonconformists, funnily enough, and a family who they had 8 children. 4 of them lost to scarlet fever. And the 4 girls who survived, one of was my great-grandmother, but the other 3 never married and had these incredible careers. One was a concert violinist who played before Liszt. Anyway, at the Royal Academy of Music. Another one was an actress, and another one travelled around, was a governess in Burma, then travelled around Scandinavia, then started a school. And so it's been really interesting trying to find them. Newspapers often are very useful, and you can pick up scraps, and there's all sorts of bits and pieces one can find. But the problem is that for much of history, most people haven't been able to write. But that's particularly exaggerated in the case of women. So if you go back to the century I work on most of the time, the 16th century, maybe 5% of women could write. So that means you just don't get the kind of literature, ego literature we call it, like diaries and letters that could tell you about their lives. And it's frustrating. And lots of different historians are finding ways to piece it together. Court records are often very important. We have to read things against the grain, as we say, and sometimes it has to be sort of inductive, like we have an account by a man, but we can see a woman in the background, and you have to then try and pivot and see what it might be from her perspective and that sort of thing. I mean, I could go on about this for a long time, but...
Yeah. I think we all be okay with that, actually. But you mentioned newspapers just briefly. Can you tell us a little bit about the impact of newspaper and print and how popular print was and the impact it meant towards researching women, the Victorian period and forward in time?
Yes, I mean, for the 19th century, newspapers are so helpful because they're everywhere. It's the local newspapers. So there's the local newspapers reporting the concert that was held at someone's house, or the fair, or the scouts went down to do so and so. I want scouts then, but you know what I mean. But you get the idea. And what I found about that is it gives us a sense of people's characters, and it fills in those gaps in family history. I mean, the story we were doing here at Cork, there's an example of. We learn about Francis Peace, for example, Sandy's ancestor, because a newspaper report says that he was highly respected, and rightly so. So you suddenly have that glimpse of character. And certainly with my family history, I've found that newspapers do exactly that as well. So one of my, I think it's great-great-grandfathers, I didn't know anything about before you did all the research. One of the newspaper articles says of him that his upright life and business methods earned him numerous friends. And otherwise it's completely factual, but there's just this one moment that says he lived an honourable life. It's really touching.
We've got a question here at the back.
Oh, yeah, lovely. Thanks, Helen.
When it comes to the newspapers, how do you prove that that person mentioned, say you're talking about, I'll go for a really common, John Smith, in that newspaper, is your John Smith your blood relative?
Well, if they're called John Smith, you definitely have a bit of a problem. You have a battle on your hands. I mean, I'm going to put past this to Jen as well, because she does this all the time, but my instinct is it's contextual information. So it will be that they're in a society they're in, or they mention their wife or their children's names, so that you can sort of triangulate and check that they're your person. Maybe it mentions their age, etc. So it will be verifying all the extra information you can find, really, into trying to ensure it's your person.
Yeah. You know the image in a movie when it's a guy standing in front of a map and it's got lines drawn and newspaper clippings and little Post-it notes all over the place and photographs? That's you. When you have a Smith or a Brown or a Johnson, right? It is taking that contextual information and essentially what you're doing is bringing in everything you know and can find alongside that newspaper article in conjunction with process of elimination, right? So if you look at the census, you go, in this village, there are 3 John Smiths, okay? Well, this guy in this newspaper article is doing A, and these 3 people do or do not match up with what that article is about. So, if for a John Smith, there might be 30 people in a census, depending on what you're looking at. So sometimes it can be very time consuming, but I promise you the reward is worth the effort. It's a great question. Thank you.
It is a great question.
So this year, we're talking about women's research in particular. Findmypast is very passionate and dedicated to kind of preserving women's stories. And as a part of that, we sponsored the inaugural Women's Prize for Nonfiction, of which you were the chair. You want to tell us just a little bit about the prize, why it's so important to you, and that experience of participating in that for the first time?
Yes, I was so grateful to Findmypast for sponsoring that. So it was a new prize this year. The Women's Prize for Fiction was started, 30 years ago, it will be next year. But a Women's Prize for Nonfiction was necessary, it turned out, because we looked at the stats, and it seems that although women are publishing nonfiction books in the same numbers as men are, when it came to all the ways that we measure success, so prizes, or newspaper coverage, or reviews, or mentions in the top 100 books, etc., women got far less coverage than men. I can give you some stats if you're interested. But so either you had to conclude in the end that women just write less well than men, or you think maybe there's something structural here. And so the Women's Prize for Nonfiction was set up to try and draw attention to excellent books by women that are based on excellent research, that are very well written, and that are original and beautifully written. And so we had our long list of 16 books, our short list of 6 books, and our winner all announced this year. And it was, amazing thing to be part of. Amazing to be part of the inaugural board of judges, I suppose, because it meant that we were shaping what it would be in the future, hopefully. We were saying, actually, it does really matter that it's got footnotes and it's been really well researched. It does matter that it's really well told. So, yeah. It was a very, very exciting process to do. It's a lot of reading. It's a lot of reading, and I loved doing it. I don't think I could do it year on year, though, so someone else is judged now.
Yeah. I'm going to capture that footnotes matter comment. I'm just going to say that out loud. Citations matter, everybody. Yeah. And I know we have a question. Helen?
Hello. I was just wondering, when we're doing family tree research, using marriage certificates and baptisms and announcements in newspapers is really useful. So I'm just wondering how you think future generations are going to research now, when culturally we don't tend to do those things as much.
So interesting. That's such an interesting question. I mean, obviously we still do have quite a lot of civil registers and the data that comes out of those. But you're absolutely right. People who have chosen never to get married, or who haven't had their children, I mean, their births have to be registered within 60 days. So births we're fine on, and deaths we're fine on. But in terms of the union of people, that will be harder to trace. I was just talking with someone, Lisa, over at the cafe, about the fact that there is also actually a bigger problem now, which is that historians of the future will not have any handwritten documents, or very few handwritten documents to look at. They'll have an absolute abundance of digital material if they're able to access it, and it will be impenetrable because there's so much of it. And so I think it will be harder for people to get at the reality, the emotions, the lives of people now, in 100 years' time, than it is for us to go 100 years back in the past. It's a real problem. It's a real problem because of the absolute vastness of digital communications day on day. I can't see how people are going to get anything meaningful out of it. Yeah, there's a question.
Helen, we've got here she comes. No, it's all right. She's right there.
Thank you. On the same sort of note, have you noticed a trend? Are there many young people who want to research family trees and move into historical research? I trained as a historian too, but I worry that there's not many coming through, and with the digital age, there may be even less.
There's lots of people doing history, and lots of people, more PhDs being done in history now than ever before. So there's definitely a great love of history, and I meet young people all the time in TV who are working as researchers and who are really keen. Family history, I think, comes to us all a little bit later. And I think generally, if we haven't loved history at school, if it hasn't been something we've kind of grown up with, I think we come to it later as well, because you become interested in where you come from and who you are as you get into your life. You know, you have to sort of have a sense of being rooted as you reach maturity. So I tend to find that family history has a slightly older demographic. That's mostly because young people are busy doing the stuff that's going to make it into those family histories in the future. So, you know, they've got other things on their mind.
I think too, though, to take the genealogy professional world side of that question, maybe, I think the availability of the network, like social media tools and that kind of thing, has allowed us to find those pockets of younger professionals coming up in the world of genealogy. Whereas, you know, when I first started my career, I was very isolated as the only young person in the room. But today I walk into a genealogy event, a conference, and I see a lot of young people in the room. I think the idea is that we're exposing history and family history as a niche to more people than ever before at an earlier age.
And I mean, to be honest, that's what the podcast is designed to do as well. It's kind of designed to say, look what you can do. You know, look what's out there.
So I think everybody in the room would agree that every family has at least one person who's that person, right? Like, keeps the stuff, finds the photographs, spends hours and hours with lots of coffee, maybe. Are you that person in your family?
Of course I am.
Is there another one? Is there anybody else? Are you?
So, I mean, I inherited the family archive, as it were, and busy, you know, finding like better archival solutions, acid-free boxes, etc., to keep things in. But there's loads, you know. I need to be a proper archivist. I mean, there's like photographs that need to be restored or looked after. So yes, I am that person, but I've sort of inherited it from my aunt, and she sort of inherited from an aunt, and quite a lot of women actually, now I think about it. But having said that, actually my great-grandfather, or my maternal great-grandfather, kept this amazing commonplace book, I guess, where he'd found newspaper articles or scraps and things about lots of Lipscombs from all over the place. And so that's been an invaluable resource for me in terms of thinking about my family history. So.
Are there any mysteries in your family history left to solve?
Well, there certainly were a couple before I did the podcast. So before I did the podcast, my mother was adopted. So I only knew her family history really back 1 or 2 generations, both in the adoptive family and in the biological family. And I knew a lot about the sort of patronyminal line, so my paternal line down through the Lipscomb men, but I didn't know so much about my paternal grandmother. I knew she was a rural and she was American, and she met my grandfather in India, and they married within 3 months. It was in the war. It was all very exciting. They were both very beautiful, but I didn't know anything about her. And then you amazingly found loads of stuff about her. So that was really exciting. So that was the kind of mystery for me.
Anything in a generation further back that if you had all the time in the world, you would still continue to explore?
Oh, gosh, there's so many things. I mean, so the one, as I say, I've been digging into those great aunts. My great aunt was very dear to me. She was called Sylvia, and I had 2, but Sylvia lived until 10 years ago. And 9 years ago, and we were very close. And she sort of gave me a bit of a charge, which is to look. Her middle name was Cleffin, and she said, "Look into the Cleffins, find out about them." And so, and she had been basically brought up by the aunts, as she called them, because her parents had been away in India. And so I have this kind of great emotional connection to that family and want to know more about them. So, I mean, it may not be all the time in the world, but I would definitely be spending quite a lot of time from here on doing more on them. Yeah.
Fabulous. No? Okay. Oh, up here, Helen. Thanks.
Thank you. You're just talking about archival solutions, and then you're talking about all the stories that you find about all the individual people in your family. I just wanted to ask you, how do you record and store that information that you find about those individuals?
Digitally. I mean, so I've taken everything that I've found and I've made digital copies of everything. And I keep lots of notes on everything I find. So I've got, massive Word documents of notes on things. And in the long run, I will be writing it up, as it were. I'll be writing it into narrative. But just keeping the process of, because there have been occasions where I have researched something and then thought it would stick in my head and then gone back and been like, why did I do that? So one has to apply to family history all the rigor of normal historical research, which is keep all the references, make sure you know where everything came from, do not think that you will remember. So that was a bit of a learning curve, but yeah, lots of notes.
Do you think you'll ever take any of those notes and extend them into another book?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if I can, books have to work in a narrative, but I'm banging on about the aunts, but I think I feel that there's a narrative there about women's lives. None of them, those three aunts, none of them had children, so there's no family. There's no descendant looking for their stories otherwise, no direct descendant. And so I feel like those women's stories shouldn't go untold just because they don't happen to have a grandchild looking into them. So, and I think there's something there. Well, we'll see if I can persuade a publisher. But I think there's something there about women's lives in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and the opportunities open to them, and those who were doing quite radical things at that time and seizing opportunities. And it's a bit, I mean, this has been told a bit, but there's a sort of sense in which we can condemn women of that period to thinking of them in a very kind of confined way. And actually, of course, they had all of the chutzpah and character that women today have. And I'd quite like to dwell with that a bit.
Another question here.
I was just wondering, if you're of a different ethnic background, so in my case I'm Chinese, how difficult is it to actually trace your ancestors based on information from China?
I haven't worked on the Chinese archives, but you're absolutely, well, I mean, obviously for a start, you've got to have language skills. So you've got to be able to go and access the archives. I've done a lot of work in European archives, and the barriers to entry can feel quite high because you've got to be able to navigate that, even just getting into an archive, getting permission to go in, getting them to find you the right stuff, being able to sort of communicate sufficiently to do that, all that stuff, finding the documents. It can feel quite intimidating. And obviously the sort of documents that survive in different countries vary enormously. So you might find great riches, but you also might find there's just absolutely a dearth of the sort of thing that you're looking for. It's really interesting to think about how we connect up some of the really rich historical sources that we know survive, that tell us about the lives of ordinary people, with family history. I think that, and maybe that's a sort of way to be thinking in the future, like court records have been enormously important for finding out the lives of ordinary people in Europe. But how do you connect those to descendants today? That it's a major piece of work. Would you add anything, Jen?
I think I would probably add, I think you're right, actually. Just the understanding how the archive works and functions and gaining access is probably the first barrier. I would say for anybody who's never experienced hands-on research in an archival situation before, practice here at home where you're comfortable first and get to know the archivist. They are here to help us. They want you to utilize their records that they're preserving. That's why they're doing their jobs. So go in and experiment and explore and understand the different types of records that are available to you, but ask a lot of questions and know that those people are our friends, right? They're here to help us, definitely.
And one other thing I'd add is the Mormons are really useful. Because, so I have not been to an archive yet where they haven't gone in and digitized all the births and marriages and death records. And I actually went recently to their archives in Salt Lake City, which were just incredible, like absolutely state of the art. And so in like tiny little provincial French archives, I found people queuing. It's quite annoying, actually, like trying to get on a microfilm machine, and there were all these genealogists getting up before me and getting to the machines. But there are, you can find incredible resources, certainly across Europe. As I say, I've only worked in India and in Europe in terms of my research, but you can start to see that there are amazing records available. You can go quite far back.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. And I don't see any. I've got one ready, though. Okay, all right.
We've talked a lot about archives and documentation. I wondered about DNA and where you see that fitting in, because I know it's helped me. I just wonder from a more professional point of view.
Such an interesting question. I mean, I think at the moment I'm still slightly on the fence with regards to DNA because, we shed part of it. I mean, like I did a podcast with Adam Rutherford, the geneticist, on not just the Tudors, which we're not promoting here, but still all the same. It was an interesting episode because he basically, you sort of shed half the DNA. As I understand it, I'm not a scientist, as you can tell immediately. But we basically, you can not have DNA, not be related to somebody that you are directly related to, if you sort of mean in DNA terms. So I don't quite understand that. But it seems that it feels like it can be a little bit of a blunt weapon. And I think that we put a lot of faith in it given those circumstances, we perhaps put undue faith in it as evidence of connection. I would rather see it used alongside the practice of documentary history, material culture, and charting one's connection in that way. Then I think if it's restrained by other historical practices, then I think it can be useful. But in itself, it can't tell you're a Viking, much as my husband would like it to.
Yeah, I have to mirror some of that as well. I have used DNA fairly extensively in my own research, but it is not a silver bullet. There's no magic answer to what we do. And it does fit alongside the historical record. You still need census records and newspaper content and military records to confirm what that science is telling you. We also have to remember that DNA is very much in its infancy as a science and as a part of our modern day world. We don't know what's going to happen in 20 years. We don't know what the future of that is. So I would recommend, and I always recommend, you be very careful, read the terms and conditions with the company that you're working with. Most of them are reputable, but you want to know what you're getting into and what you're actually giving away when you take that test. But it is not a silver bullet to the straight answer, right? It's just not. You have to have the archival material alongside.
Scary thought there, wasn't there?
It can be a little bit, actually, but I think it's better to be very transparent about the fact that, scientists are using these samples and there's not a lot of transparency there, I suppose. We don't know, right? Who knows what's going to happen in 100 years?
They're cloning you.
So I think that covers us for time. But we want to thank you again for being with us today at Cock Abbey. It's incredible to have you. And thank all of you very much for joining us and asking such wonderful questions. It's been a really incredible discussion.
Thanks, Jen.